Welcome back to Untold Crime Legends, where we take you deep into the real stories that shaped America's darkest chapters. And today we're stepping into New York City in 1935, a place where power ruled the streets. Loyalty meant everything, and a single sentence could sign a death warrant. This was an era when the underworld didn't need paperwork or courts, because respect itself was the law, and breaking that law came with a price no one could escape. The city pulsed with illegal money, whispered deals, and men who lived knowing tomorrow was never promised. Gangsters didn't just fight over territory, they fought over pride, reputation, and fear, because fear kept people in line. In this world, words carried weight, and insults weren't brushed off or forgotten. They were remembered, repeated, and repaid in blood. Tonight's story isn't about a long war planned over months or years. It's about how one reckless insult lit a fuse that was already burning, and how that moment set off a chain reaction that left bodies on the pavement and changed the balance of power forever in Harlem and beyond. At the center of this storm stood Dutch Schultz, one of the most feared gangsters in America, a man whose name alone could close businesses and empty streets. Schultz built his empire on bootlegging, extortion, and violence, and he was known for his explosive temper and absolute belief that fear was the best business strategy. He didn't negotiate as much as he demanded, and when people resisted, they usually didn't resist for long. Dutch saw New York as his chessboard, and everyone else as pieces to be moved or crushed. He believed money bought him authority everywhere, even in neighborhoods he didn't understand. To Schultz, Harlem wasn't a community with its own rules and leaders. It was simply another source of profit waiting to be taken. That arrogance had carried him far, but it also blinded him. He underestimated the power of local loyalty, and more dangerously, he underestimated a man who understood that respect on the streets was stronger than any gunman Schultz could hire. Man was Ellsworth, Bumpy Johnson, a quiet but commanding presence in Harlem who ruled through intelligence, patience, and deep-rooted respect. Bumpy wasn't loud, and he didn't need to be. People listened when he spoke because they trusted him, and they stood with him because he stood with them. He understood the streets not as a battlefield, but as a living network of relationships, favors, and unspoken rules. Bumpy's influence didn't come from terror alone, from the belief that he protected Harlem's interests against outsiders who saw the neighborhood only as a cash machine. He dressed sharp, spoke carefully, and thought several steps ahead. To Bumpy, power wasn't about taking everything at once. It was about knowing when to hold back and when to let others make mistakes. And in 1935, Dutch Schultz walked straight into one of the biggest mistakes of his life. The conflict between Schultz and Bumpy didn't begin with violence. It began with business, which in that world was often more dangerous. The numbers racket in Harlem was booming, generating huge profits every single day, and Schultz wanted in. He wanted control, partnership, and he made it clear that he expected Bumpy Johnson to step aside. Bumpy refused, not loudly or dramatically, but firmly. Harlem's numbers were run by Harlem, and that wasn't up for discussion. This wasn't just about money. It was about who had the right to operate in the neighborhood and who answered to whom. Tension filled the air as messages were passed back and forth, each side testing the other's resolve. Schultz saw Bumpy's refusal as defiance. Bumpy saw Schultz's demands as disrespect. And in a world where disrespect was the deadliest currency, both men knew something had to give. What happened next is the moment history would remember as the deadly insult. Dutch Schultz, angry and impatient, publicly hurled a racial slur at Bumpy Johnson, dismissing him not just as a rival, but as a man unworthy of respect. This wasn't a private comment whispered behind closed doors. It was said openly, carelessly, and with the kind of arrogance that only comes from someone who believes they're untouchable. In the criminal underworld of 1935, kind of insult wasn't just offensive, it was a declaration of war. Schultz wasn't just attacking Bumpy as an individual, he was insulting Harlem itself. Word spread fast, faster than bullets ever could, carried by bartenders, runners, and men who knew exactly what that slur meant. Once those words hit the streets, there was no undoing them, and no apology that could erase the damage. Harlem reacted the way Harlem always did when one of its own was disrespected by an outsider. Quietly at first, then all at once, Bumpy Johnson didn't call a meeting or give a speech. He didn't need to. The streets understood the message without it being spoken aloud. Respect had been violated, and respect had to be restored. Within days, the city began to feel the shift. Men connected to Schultz started watching their backs a little more closely. Cars slowed down at corners. Familiar faces disappeared from their usual spots. The tension was thick, and everyone in the underworld knew something was coming. This wasn't chaos, it was preparation. Harlem wasn't reacting emotionally, it was responding strategically. That made it far more dangerous than a reckless shootout ever could be. Then the violence erupted, sudden and relentless. Shootings broke out in places that had once been considered safe. Ambushes happened in broad daylight, sending a clear message that no one was beyond reach. Enforcers tied to Schultz were hunted down with precision, random acts of brutality, but targeted strikes meant to weaken his grip. Each attack answered the insult with action, reinforcing the rule that words carried consequences. The streets that once buzzed with music and conversation fell silent as people stayed indoors, listening for sirens and gunshots. Fear returned, but this time it wasn't just fear of Dutch Schultz. It was fear of a community that had unified against him. Every body that fell made it clearer that this wasn't a short skirmish. This was a reckoning. By the end of a single week, 8 men were dead, their lives erased by a conflict sparked by pride and fueled by disrespect. These weren't nameless casualties. They were soldiers, allies, and associates who paid the price for one man's arrogance. Each death sent shockwaves through the underworld, forcing everyone to reassess their positions. Schultz's organization felt the losses immediately, not just in manpower, but in confidence. His reputation for invincibility began to crack. The streets whispered that Dutch had gone too far this time. He had crossed a line he didn't understand. Meanwhile, Bumpy Johnson remained in the background, untouched, his power growing with every mistake his enemy made. He hadn't pulled the trigger himself, but his influence was written all over the outcome. It's important to understand that the insult itself wasn't the true cause of the bloodshed. It was the spark that ignited tensions already waiting to explode. Schultz wanted control. Harlem wanted respect. Those two goals couldn't exist side by side. Bumpy Johnson understood that reckless revenge would only invite more chaos, so he let the streets deliver the response naturally by allowing events to unfold through established networks and loyalties. He avoided drawing unnecessary attention to himself while still achieving his goal. The message was clear without ever being spoken directly. Harlem would not be disrespected, and outsiders who failed to understand that would pay dearly. This wasn't about ego alone. It was about maintaining order in a world where order was enforced by reputation and consequence. As the bodies piled up, law enforcement took notice, and rival gangs watched closely from the sidelines. Schultz's actions had drawn unwanted heat, not just from the police, but from other criminals who saw opportunity in his weakening position. His grip on Harlem loosened, and his enemies multiplied. Men who once feared him now questioned his judgment. In the underworld, perception is everything, and Schultz's perception had shifted from unstoppable to reckless. Meanwhile, Bumpy Johnson's standing only grew stronger. He was seen as a leader who protected his people without exposing them unnecessarily. Balance of strength and restraint made him far more dangerous than someone who relied on fear alone. The city had learned a lesson, and it was watching closely to see how Schultz would respond. Dutch Schultz never truly recovered from the consequences of that insult. His arrogance continued to isolate him, and his inability to understand the cultural and social dynamics of Harlem left him vulnerable. The war he ignited over a slur cost him allies, territory, and credibility. Eventually, the enemies he made, both black and white, criminal and institutional, closed in from all sides. The underworld has a way of punishing those who refuse to learn its rules, and Schultz was no exception. His downfall didn't happen overnight, but the seeds were planted the moment he opened his mouth and spoke words he couldn't take back. In a world where silence is often safer than speech, he chose insult over strategy, and it proved fatal in more ways than one. For Bumpy Johnson, the aftermath reinforced everything he already knew about power. He hadn't needed to shout, threaten, or publicly humiliate his rival. He let respect do the work for him. Harlem remembered who stood up for it and who tried to exploit it. Bumpy's legacy grew not because he was the most violent man on the street, but because he understood the street better than anyone else. He knew when to act, when to wait, and when to let others destroy themselves. Wisdom is what allowed him to survive in a world where survival was never guaranteed. The events of 1935 became a defining moment in Harlem's criminal history, one that proved respect wasn't optional, it was essential. In the end, this story stands as a powerful reminder of how deadly words can be when spoken in the wrong place, at the wrong time, to the wrong man. In 1935 New York, insults weren't just personal attacks, they were challenges to entire communities. Dutch Schultz learned that lesson the hard way, and 8 men lost their lives because he failed to understand it. The streets don't forget, and they don't forgive easily. Power built on arrogance is fragile, but power built on respect can endure even the bloodiest storms. This has been Untold Crime Legends, bringing you the true stories behind the myths where history, crime, and human pride collide, and where a single insult can change everything forever.